My stepmom treated me like a maid for 12 years in my own house, but when I found out I was the legal owner, I kicked them all out, and now they live in a two-bedroom while I'm living in peace. I'm 22 years old. I work at Starbucks while taking online classes, and I basically just kicked out my stepmother and her kids from my house after years of them treating me like their personal servant. And when I say my house, I don't mean it metaphorically or like, oh, this is my family home. No, I mean, I am literally the legal owner of this four-bedroom property in a super nice neighborhood near Boston, and they had no idea until I dropped it in the middle of a family dinner like 3 months ago. But anyway, let me start from the beginning, because this story is long, and I need you to understand the full context of why I did what I did. My mom died when I was 8 years old. Breast cancer, it was horrible, and honestly, I don't remember much from that time except that everything was sad and confusing, and my dad basically completely fell apart. He was like 32 when it happened. I was his only daughter, and I think he just didn't know how to be a single parent. My maternal grandparents, so, like, my mom's parents, moved in with us almost immediately after the funeral because someone had to take care of me while my dad worked all day and tried to process his grief. We were living in a small apartment at that time, and with my grandparents there, things were tight, so they decided to buy a big house, a four-bedroom one in a really nice neighborhood. So we'd all have space, and I could grow up in a good place. They paid for the house completely, in cash, because they'd sold their business or something and had good money saved up. My dad moved in with us but never paid for anything. My grandparents covered everything because they wanted to make sure I was well taken care of. Things were calm for a couple of years. My grandparents took me to school, helped me with homework, cooked, and basically raised me while my dad worked at his consulting company or whatever it is he does. But then, like 2 years after my mom died, my dad met Sharon at a business conference. Sharon was 33. At the time, she'd been married before, had 2 kids from that marriage, Zachary, who was like 15, and Samantha, who was 11. And according to my dad, she was amazing and exactly what he needed. They got married literally 6 months after meeting, and I remember sitting at that wedding thinking, really? That fast? But I was a 10-year-old kid. What did I know? When Sharon and her kids moved into our house, things changed immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean like within the first week, Sharon was already reorganizing everything, telling my grandparents their decorating style was dated, and assigning me chores like I was her household employee. At first it was subtle, like, Isabel, could you help me wash these dishes? Or, Isabel, could you fold this laundry? But within months, I was basically doing all the household chores, while Zachary spent all his time in his room playing video games, and Samantha obsessed over her phone and social media. My grandparents tried to say something, but Sharon was super manipulative with my dad, and he always took her side, saying things like, it's important for Isabel to learn responsibility, or Sharon is just trying to create a united family. My grandparents lived with us until 2019, when they passed away within a few months of each other. My grandmother first, from a heart attack, and then my grandfather like 3 months later, I think literally from sadness because he couldn't live without her. It was devastating. They were the only people who really protected me in that house, and when they were gone, I felt completely alone. What I didn't know, what nobody knew except my grandparents' lawyer, was that they had put the house deed in my name before they died. They literally left me the house, but with a clause that I couldn't sell or make legal changes until I turned 21. The lawyer had instructions to contact me when I reached that age, but for some reason he never did until I contacted him. But I'll get to that part. After my grandparents died, Sharon basically completely took over the house. She turned my grandparents' room into her personal office, even though she doesn't work, redesigned the living room, changed all the rules, and I went from doing some chores to literally doing all the chores. I'm talking about cleaning the entire house, doing everyone's laundry, cooking dinner every night, washing dishes, taking out the trash, mowing the lawn in summer, shoveling snow in winter, everything. And meanwhile, Zachary, who by then was like 20 years old, did absolutely nothing except play video games and say he was going to be a famous content creator. And Samantha spent all her time taking selfies and spending the money my dad gave her on clothes and makeup. My dad worked so much he was basically never home. And when he was, Sharon had him so manipulated that he thought everything was perfect. I finished high school, started working at Starbucks because I needed my own money, and enrolled in online classes at a community college because Sharon had convinced my dad it wasn't worth spending money to send me to a real university. I worked like 30 hours a week, took classes, and still had to come home and do all the chores while my stepmother and her kids lived like royalty in what I thought was my dad's house. Years went by like this. Literally years. And I was exhausted and depressed but felt like I had no options. Because I didn't have enough money to move out and Sharon had convinced me that if I left, I'd be alone and probably end up on the streets. Then, like 6 months ago, right after I turned 22, Sharon drops on me at breakfast that I need to start paying rent. She tells me, in that sweet fake voice she uses when my dad is around, that I'm an adult now and it's time for me to contribute financially to the house, and that I need to give her $800 a month plus my share of utilities. $800 plus utilities. And keep doing all the household chores. While Zachary, who's 25 years old and hasn't worked a day in his life, and Samantha, who's 21 and my dad pays for everything including her college, don't pay a cent. I was so furious I literally couldn't even speak. But my dad just nodded and said it seemed reasonable, so what was I going to do? That night I started looking at apartments on Craigslist, just to see what I could afford on my Starbucks salary, and basically nothing decent was in my price range. I was crying in my room, feeling miserable and trapped, when I remembered something my grandmother had told me before she died. She had said, "Isabel, your grandfather and I have made sure you'll always have a roof over your head, no matter what happens." At the time I thought she was just being sweet, you know, like a comforting grandma phrase, but something made me think. I Googled the name of the lawyer who had handled my grandparents' estate, found his number, and called him the next day. I swear, when that lawyer told me I was the legal owner of the house since 2019, I literally thought he was joking. I asked him to repeat it like 3 times, and then he sent me copies of all the documents by email. The deed was in my name. My grandparents had bought the house specifically for me, put it in a trust until I turned 21, and then the lawyer was supposed to contact me. But there had been some administrative error or something and he never did. But it didn't matter. The house was mine. Legally, completely, indisputably, mine. My dad was technically a tenant, as were Sharon and her kids, although none of them were paying rent because I didn't even know I was the owner. I spent like 2 weeks processing this information and deciding what to do. Part of me wanted to immediately go and yell at everyone, but the smarter part of me knew I needed a plan. I hired a lawyer, a different one who specialized in real estate law and evictions, and he helped me understand my options. Basically, I could ask them to leave. I could charge them rent. I could do whatever I wanted because it was my property. I decided I'd first give them the chance to treat me with respect and pay fair rent, and if they didn't, I'd kick them out. Sounds reasonable, right? I organized a family dinner, something we never do because normally everyone eats at different times, but I insisted. I told my dad I needed to talk to everyone about something important. Sharon immediately assumed I was going to announce I was moving out, and honestly, she seemed excited about the idea, which made me sick. I made lasagna, set the table nicely, and waited until everyone was seated and eating. Then, very casually, I dropped the bomb. I said something like, "Well, Sharon mentioned I should start paying rent, and I've been thinking about that, and you're right. It's important that all adults in this house contribute financially." So I did some research on rental prices in this area and talked to a lawyer. And it turns out this house legally belongs to me, not Dad, so technically you've all been living free in my property for years. The silence was incredible. Like, you could hear the kitchen clock ticking. My dad dropped his fork. Sharon went pale, then red, then like purple. Zachary stopped chewing with food still in his mouth. Samantha said, "What?" And I just smiled and pulled out copies of the deed and passed them around. My dad took them with shaking hands and read them, and I could see the exact moment he realized it was real. Sharon tried to grab the papers from him, read them herself, and then exploded. She started screaming that this was impossible, that my grandparents would never do something like this, that obviously the papers were fake, that I had done something illegal, that she was going to call the police. I just sat there, super calm, and told her to call whoever she wanted, that everything was completely legal and verifiable. My dad said nothing, just looked completely shocked, and I realized he probably never knew my grandparents had bought the house. Probably Sharon had made him believe they were just helping with payments or something. Zachary finally swallowed his food and said something stupid like, "This is so unfair," and I almost laughed because unfair? Really? Sharon tried a different tactic. She suddenly calmed down, put on her victim voice, and told my dad that obviously this was a sign that I needed independence, and that maybe it would be better for me to move into a dorm at university, that they'd be happy to help me pack, that they could turn my room into a home gym for her. I literally laughed in her face. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, that this was my house, and that if anyone was moving out, it would be them. My dad tried to speak, tried to say something about family and respect and finding a solution together, but I'd had enough. I told them I had recorded a conversation Sharon had with Samantha 2 days earlier where she was literally planning how to manipulate the situation to make me look bad and force me to leave, and I pulled out my phone and played the recording. Sharon had said horrible things, like that I was a leech and a burden, and that they'd finally have their house to themselves without having to see my sad face every day. Samantha's voice on the recording, laughing and saying, "Oh, Mom, you're mean," was the cherry on top. My dad looked devastated, and Sharon looked trapped. Then I put my terms on the table. I told them they had 2 options. Option 1. Zachary, Sharon, and Samantha each pay me $1,200 monthly rent, plus a third of utilities. Start doing their own chores. Treat me with basic respect. And we can try to make this work. Option 2. They leave. I told them my dad could stay for free, because after all, he's my dad, and I'm not going to throw him out on the street, but that he'd have to decide whether he was staying with me or leaving with Sharon. I gave them 48 hours to decide. Sharon had a complete mental breakdown. She screamed for like an hour, calling me everything, saying I was an ungrateful bitch, that after everything she'd done for me, how dare I, that she was going to sue me, that she was going to destroy me. Zachary and Samantha just sat there looking uncomfortable and confused. I think because they were finally realizing their mom had no power in this situation. My dad went to his room without saying anything. The next few days were total chaos. Sharon contacted 3 different lawyers, trying to find a way to invalidate the deed or prove I wasn't the owner, but obviously they all told her the same thing. The house was legally mine and there was nothing she could do. She tried to convince my dad to force me to sell them the house, but A, I didn't have to do that, and B, they definitely didn't have money to buy a 4-bedroom house in this neighborhood. She tried to get relatives and friends to call me and pressure me, but I blocked everyone I didn't know well. When the 48 hours passed, I called my lawyer and he prepared formal eviction documents for Sharon, Zachary, and Samantha. Not for my dad, just for them. I gave them 30 days to leave, which is more than I legally had to give them, according to my lawyer, because technically they'd never signed a rental contract. My dad, by the way, decided to leave with Sharon, which hurt but didn't surprise me. He told me I'd given him no choice, and that he couldn't abandon his wife. And I told him he'd been abandoning me for years, so this wasn't different. During those 4 weeks, Sharon tried everything. She tried to sabotage the house, like leaving faucets running or breaking things, accidentally. I installed security cameras all over the house, which, by the way, were also legal because it was my property. I caught her trying to steal my mom's jewelry, which my grandparents had saved for me in a safe box in their closet. In the recording, you could clearly see her opening the box, taking out necklaces and earrings, and putting them in her purse. I called the police immediately and filed a report. The cops were super professional, recovered the jewelry, and even though Sharon cried and tried to say it was a misunderstanding, it was officially on record. The day they had to leave was almost comical in how dramatic it was. Sharon tried to give a speech like, "Someday you'll regret this," while the movers I hired, because yes, I hired the movers and billed her for it later, packed their stuff. Zachary was crying because he had to leave his gaming setup. Samantha was recording everything for her social media, probably trying to make me look bad, but honestly, I didn't care. And my dad just looked old and tired. A sheriff's deputy came to supervise that everything was legal and there were no problems, which was satisfying in a weird way. Sharon, Zachary, and Samantha moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a less nice part of town, living in Sharon's sister's space, who wasn't very happy to have them there from what I heard later. My dad stayed with them for a while, but then they found a place just for Sharon and him, but much smaller, obviously. Zachary had to get a job at GameStop, which I found ironic considering all his big ambitions of being a content creator. Samantha had to transfer to a cheaper university and moved between Sharon's apartment and some friends' places. I, meanwhile, made complete changes to the house. I redesigned Sharon's room as a real office for me where I can study and eventually work from home when I finish my degree. Zachary's room, I turned into a really nice guest room. Samantha's room stayed pretty much the same, but I painted the walls a color I like. I hired someone to do a deep clean of the entire house to remove any trace of them. And best of all, I contacted Christina, my mom's best friend, who had lost touch with us after Sharon arrived, and offered to rent her a room for a super reasonable price. She accepted immediately, and now we live together. And she's like the big sister, or aunt I always wanted, and we talk about my mom, and she tells me stories I never knew. And it's beautiful. The house is peaceful now. No drama, no yelling, no one treating me like a servant. I do my own chores, and Christina does hers, and sometimes we cook together. But because we want to, not because we have to. My dad calls me from time to time, trying to rebuild our relationship, I guess. And I answer sometimes. But the truth is, I'm working on forgiving him, but I don't know if I'll ever forget how he let me suffer all those years. Sharon tries to contact me sometimes from unknown numbers, leaving voicemails where she alternates between insulting me and begging me to do the right thing and give them back the house, as if that made any sense. I just delete them. I'm 22 years old and I own a 4-bedroom house in an incredible neighborhood near Boston. I work at Starbucks, study online, and finally have the space and peace of mind to think about my future. Christina and I watched a movie last night and she made popcorn and we laughed a lot. And at one point she asked me if I missed having my family there. And honestly, I told her no. Because that was never really family. You know? Family doesn't treat you like garbage. Family doesn't use you. Family doesn't try to steal what's yours. Christina is more family to me after 6 months of living together than Sharon and her kids were in all those years. And that's enough for me.